Your Honor, may I say something? A hushed murmur rippled through the packed courtroom as all eyes turned to the small, trembling figure rising from her seat. Emma Gray, just 11 years old, stood with her hands clenched around a worn-out notebook. Her auburn hair fell over her face, but nothing could hide the sheer determination in her eyes. At the defendant's table, her father, Jason Gray, sat motionless, his head lowered, his fate hanging in the balance. The evidence against him was suffocating. Security, footage, a witness statement, even cash found hidden beneath their floorboards. The prosecutor had painted him as a desperate man who had resorted to armed robbery. And the jury? Their expressions were unreadable, but Emma could feel it. They were ready to declare him guilty. The tension in the room thickened as Judge Carver adjusted his glasses and peered down at Emma. His expression softened, if only slightly. "You realize this is highly irregular, young lady," he said, his deep voice carrying over the courtroom. "Yes, sir," Emma answered, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I have something to say that might change everything." A low wave of whispers swept through the crowd. The prosecutor shot up from his seat, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate." Judge Carver raised a hand, silencing him with a sharp look. "Let her speak." Emma swallowed hard and tightened her grip on the notebook. "The night of the robbery, my dad wasn't there. He was with me." A collective gasp filled the room. Jason's head snapped up, his tired eyes wide with shock. "Emma, no," he whispered under his breath, his voice thick with emotion. But Emma wasn't backing down. She lifted her chin, her voice stronger now. "And I can prove it." For the first time since the trial began, uncertainty flickered in the prosecutor's eyes. The judge leaned forward, the air in the courtroom so heavy that it felt like no one dared to breathe. Emma could feel the weight of every gaze locked onto her, some curious, some doubtful, some filled with pity. But none of that mattered. She had come here to do one thing, save her father. And she wasn't leaving without trying. Emma's fingers trembled around the edges of her notebook, but her voice had steadied. The moment she had spoken, she saw something flicker across her father's face. Something fragile, something hopeful. He looked at her like he wanted to believe this nightmare could still end. But to make them believe, she had to start at the beginning. 3 months earlier, their home had been different. It wasn't much, just a small old house with creaky floors and chipped paint, but it was theirs. It had been quieter since her mom passed. Too quiet. Like something vital had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow space neither she nor her dad knew how to fill. Jason Gray had never been the kind of man to ask for help. Even when the bills stacked higher than he could handle, even when the second job meant barely getting 3 hours of sleep, even when grief settled over him like a weight too heavy to lift, he just kept going. Emma would wake up most mornings to find a note on the kitchen table, scribbled in her dad's messy handwriting. "Breakfast is ready. Be good at school. Love you, kid." And every evening, no matter how exhausted he was, he made it home in time for dinner. Sometimes, he'd even manage a tired smile as he asked about her day, nodding along while she told him about school, about her book reports, about how she was getting better at fractions. He tried. She knew he tried. That night, though, something was different. She had been curled up on the couch, working on a school project, waiting for the familiar sound of the front door unlocking. It was late, later than usual. The house creaked around her, the dim glow of the lamp flickering slightly as a draft snuck in through the old windows. Then, finally, the door swung open. Her dad stepped inside, but this wasn't like the other nights. His face was pale, his breaths uneven, his hands, they were shaking. Emma sat up, instantly. "Dad?" Jason blinked, as if he had forgotten she'd be awake. Then, forcing a weak smile, he ruffled her hair. "Hey, sweetheart, didn't I tell you not to wait up?" She frowned. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said too quickly, shrugging off his jacket. "Just a long day." But she wasn't convinced. She noticed the way he flexed his fingers, as if trying to shake off something that clung to them. The way his eyes darted toward the window, as if expecting to see someone there. The way he sat at the table but didn't touch the dinner she had saved for him. Something had happened. And even though she didn't know what, she knew one thing for certain. Her dad was scared. Jason Gray wasn't a man who scared easily. So whatever had shaken him that night, it had to be something big. The morning started like any other, until it didn't. Emma had barely rubbed the sleep from her eyes when the sharp, jarring wail of sirens shattered the quiet. The red and blue lights flashed against her bedroom walls, pulsing like a warning she didn't understand yet. Then came the pounding on the front door. She scrambled out of bed, heart hammering as she rushed to the hallway. Her father was already there, standing frozen in the dim morning light, his face pale, his jaw clenched. "Jason Gray, open up!" Her father hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. Then, with a slow breath, he reached for the doorknob and pulled it open. The police swarmed inside, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, their voices loud, commanding. Emma barely had time to register what was happening before two officers grabbed her dad, twisting his arms behind his back. "Dad!" she screamed, rushing forward, but a firm hand caught her shoulder, holding her back. Jason didn't fight. He didn't struggle. He just turned his head, searching for her through the chaos. "Stay strong, Emma," he called over the noise, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you." Then they shoved him out the door. The next thing she knew, she was standing barefoot on the porch, the morning air biting against her skin, watching her father being pushed into the back of a police car. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, murmuring to each other. Some whispered behind their hands, casting her pitiful glances. Others shook their heads like they had seen this coming. Emma felt her stomach twist. They thought he was guilty. The reality hit her like a weight she couldn't lift. Aunt Karen arrived before Emma even had time to process what had happened. She barely had time to grab her backpack before she was being ushered into her aunt's car, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. She stared out the window as they drove away, her heart pounding against her ribs. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. But it was. And it got worse. Because by the time she was sitting at Aunt Karen's kitchen table, listening to the hushed conversation happening in the other room, the full picture of what they were accusing her father of finally sank in. The police had evidence. A masked man matching Jason's height and build had been caught on security footage robbing a convenience store, wielding a crowbar. A witness had identified him. And the worst part? They had found money hidden under the floorboards of their house. $1,200. Emma's breath hitched. They thought her dad had stolen it, that he had been desperate, that he had cracked. But they were wrong. They had to be. Because she knew, deep in her bones, her father didn't do this, and she was going to prove it. Emma sat on the edge of the bed in Aunt Karen's guest room, her fingers gripping the fabric of the blanket as if holding on to something solid might keep her world from falling apart. Everyone else had already made up their minds. The police, the neighbors, even Aunt Karen, though she never said it outright. They all thought her dad had done it, that he had walked into that convenience store, taken the money, and destroyed his own life in one reckless decision. But they were wrong. Emma knew her father. She knew the way he always double-checked the locks at night, the way he counted every dollar before paying bills, the way he refused to even take a free coffee from the gas station because Nothing in life comes for free. That wasn't the kind of man who would steal, which meant one thing. Somewhere, there was a missing piece. She flipped open her notebook and started writing, every detail she could remember about the night before he was arrested. The time he came home. What he said. What he did. Even the way he looked at her when she asked if he was okay. Something wasn't right. She went over it again and again, replaying it in her mind, trying to make sense of it. Her father had been scared that night. Really scared. But not like someone who had committed a crime. More like someone who had seen something they weren't supposed to. Then, suddenly, she remembered. The birdhouse. That night, before he told her to go to bed, they had been working on her school project, a wooden birdhouse for her class assignment. Her dad had been sanding down the edges, shaking his head at her choice of bright blue paint. "It's going to be the only house on the block with neon walls." "Exactly," she had grinned. "Birds need style, too." And then, she had taken a picture. Emma's heart pounded as she scrambled off the bed, nearly knocking over her chair in her rush to get to her backpack. She tore through the side pocket, past broken pencils and gum wrappers, until her fingers closed around something solid, a Polaroid. She pulled it out, staring at the faded image of her dad, mid-laugh, holding the half-finished birdhouse in his hands. The warm glow of the living room lamp spilled behind him, casting soft shadows. She flipped it over. Her breath caught. The time. 9:47 p.m. Her father had been at home at the exact time the robbery took place across town. Emma clutched the photo, her pulse hammering. This wasn't just a memory. This was proof. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that carried weight. Like the entire room was holding its breath at once. Emma stood in the middle of it, gripping the Polaroid in her small hands, her knuckles white. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to focus. "This was taken the night of the robbery," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her legs trembling beneath her. "At exactly 9:47 p.m., my dad was home. With me." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even Judge Carver, who had spent decades hearing every kind of testimony imaginable, leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses. Jason Gray, sitting at the defendant's table, exhaled sharply. His eyes filled with something Emma hadn't seen in days. Hope. The prosecutor, however, was already shaking his head. "A photograph?" he scoffed, standing up. He strode toward her, hands tucked behind his back, his expression calm but sharp, like a wolf circling prey. "Miss Gray, with all due respect, a picture does not prove when it was taken." Emma clenched her jaw, lifting the Polaroid higher. "There's a timestamp on the bottom." The prosecutor waved a dismissive hand. "A timestamp on a printed photograph? That could have been added later. Or maybe your father asked you to take it earlier in the day to create an alibi." "No," Emma shot back, her voice rising. "It wasn't like that. I didn't even remember taking this until yesterday." The prosecutor sighed dramatically, as if he were trying to be patient with her. "Emma," he said, using her first name in a way that made her skin crawl. "I know you want to help your father, but let's be realistic. This is not enough evidence to—" I wrote it down. The words left her lips before she had time to hesitate. The prosecutor stopped mid-step. "Excuse me?" Emma took a shaky breath, flipping open her notebook. She turned to the page from that night, the ink slightly smudged from where she had pressed too hard. "I write everything down," she said, her voice firmer now. "Every night. I write about my day, what happened, what I saw." She turned the book so the judge could see. "And this page is from that night." She swallowed, pointing to a specific line in her hurried handwriting. Dad came home late. We worked on my birdhouse. He kept making jokes about the blue paint. We finished around 10. Then I went to bed. The room was no longer silent. Murmurs broke out, some loud enough that Judge Carver had to bang his gavel for order. The defense attorney stood, his voice laced with urgency. Your Honor, this aligns perfectly with our claim that Jason Gray was at home during the time of the robbery. The time-stamped photo and the contemporaneous notes in Emma's journal, both taken without any premeditated intent, strongly support his alibi. The prosecutor, for the first time since the trial began, looked slightly uncertain. He quickly masked it, straightening his tie. Diary entry is hardly indisputable evidence, he said, though his tone wasn't as firm as before. And a single photograph doesn't override multiple witnesses, security footage, and cash found in the defendant's possession. Emma felt frustration build in her chest. Look at the picture, she snapped. You can see the unfinished birdhouse in his hands. If you check my school records, you'll see that I turned it in the very next day. She turned to the judge now, desperation creeping into her voice. How could he have been robbing a store at the same time he was helping me finish my project? Judge Carver didn't answer right away. He studied her, then looked at the Polaroid, then back at her notebook. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden surface of his bench. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. The court will adjourn for further review of this evidence, he said, his voice measured. We will reconvene once a thorough investigation has been conducted. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The gavel struck. Court was dismissed. But as Emma turned toward her father, ready to rush to his side, her eyes flickered to the back of the room. And that's when she saw him. A man in a dark hoodie slipping through the doors, his shoulders hunched, his movements careful, deliberate, and even from across the courtroom, Emma could tell. He looked scared. Her breath caught in her throat. Why was he running? And more importantly, what did he know? Emma's pulse quickened. She had spent days feeling helpless, like a child trapped in a world where no one listened to her. But now, standing in the middle of the courtroom, she saw something no one else had noticed, a man slipping away. He moved fast, keeping his head low, his dark hoodie pulled up just enough to cast a shadow over his face. He didn't pause to speak to anyone, didn't look at the judge, the jury, or even the exit sign. He just moved with a purpose. To get out. Emma's instinct screamed. She wasn't sure why, but she knew. He knows something. Without thinking, she took a step forward. Then another. Emma? Aunt Karen's voice called out behind her, but she barely heard it. Her sneakers hit the courthouse floor in quick strides as she pushed through the crowd, weaving between spectators and reporters. The man was already at the back of the room, pushing open the double doors. He didn't run. He didn't have to. No one else was paying attention. But Emma was. She slipped through the doors just as they swung back, catching sight of him moving toward the courthouse steps. The outside air hit her skin like a slap, sharp and cold, but she didn't stop. The man was halfway down the steps, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pocket. He glanced around once, a quick flick of his gaze before turning toward the street. Emma sped up. Hey! The man stiffened. For the briefest second, he hesitated, like he was deciding whether to pretend he hadn't heard her. Then he bolted. Emma didn't think. She just ran. Her legs pumped, her breath quickening as she tore down the steps after him. People turned to stare, confused. A security officer called out something, but she didn't stop. The man cut left down a crowded sidewalk, ducking between pedestrians. Emma followed, ignoring the startled glances thrown her way. She wasn't fast enough to close the gap, but She wasn't losing him either. He glanced over his shoulder, and that was his mistake. The moment of hesitation cost him. His foot caught against the curb, just enough to throw him off balance. He stumbled. Emma pushed forward, ignoring the burn in her legs. Just as she got within reach, a bus rumbled past, blocking her path for half a second. When it cleared, he was gone. Emma skidded to a stop, whipping her head left and right. Nothing. No dark hoodie, no nervous glances, just a sea of strangers moving like nothing had happened. Her heart pounded. Number, no, no, no. She turned in a slow circle, searching the crowd. Had he ducked into a store? An alley? Had he disappeared into a car? She had been so close. Her fingers curled into fists, frustration bubbling inside her. Who was he? And more importantly, why did he run? Emma didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the chase in her mind. The hooded man had run. Not just walked away, not just avoided eye contact. He ran. That meant something, and she wasn't going to let it go. The next morning, she did something she knew Aunt Karen wouldn't approve of. She grabbed her notebook, stuffed it into her backpack, and left the house before anyone could ask where she was going. She went back to the courthouse, then retraced her steps, scanning every alley, every storefront, every street corner. She had no real plan, only instinct. And then finally, she found him. He was leaning against a lamppost near an old bus station, hands shoved deep into his hoodie, his body language screaming, "I don't want to be noticed." But it was him. The same build, the same slouched shoulders. Emma's heart pounded. This was her chance. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked straight toward him. The man noticed her just as she was a few feet away. His entire body tensed. "Hey," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just want to talk." He turned sharply, ready to bolt again. Emma reacted instantly. "If you run, I'll scream." The words were out before she even had time to process them. The man froze. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, he really looked at her. His face wasn't as old as she'd expected, maybe mid-20s, dark circles under his eyes, fear written all over his expression. Emma swallowed hard. "You were at the courthouse." The man didn't answer. "You left the second I showed the Polaroid." Still nothing. Emma took a step closer. "You know something." At that, his face twisted into something almost pained. "Kid," he muttered, voice low, "you don't want to be asking these questions. My dad is innocent." Her voice was firm now. "And you know it." The man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his messy hair. He looked around like he was making sure no one was watching. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "He's being set up." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers dug into the straps of her backpack. "By who?" The man shook his head. "I can't." "Yes, you can." She stepped in front of him, refusing to let him slip away again. "You don't understand. He's in jail. If you know the truth, you have to tell someone." His eyes darted around again. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "The people who did this, they're dangerous. If I talk, I'm next." Emma's stomach twisted. Dangerous? How deep did this go? Before she could ask more, something shifted in the air. A black SUV rolled up to the curb. The doors didn't open, but the windows were tinted so dark that Emma couldn't see inside. The hooded man's entire body went rigid. "Oh no," he whispered. Emma barely had time to react before he grabbed her arm. "Run." She didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted, her legs pumping as fast as they could. The sound of car doors slamming behind her sent adrenaline crashing through her system. Footsteps, heavy, fast. They were coming. The man grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward an alley. "This way!" Emma didn't argue. She followed, weaving between dumpsters and abandoned crates, her breath ragged. Behind them, she heard voices, sharp, angry. Find them. Her heart pounded. They weren't just after him. They were after her. Emma's lungs burned as she sprinted through the alley, the hooded man leading the way. The heavy footsteps behind them echoed off the brick walls, growing louder, closer. Then, sharp, screeching tires. The black SUV skidded to a stop at the alley's entrance, blocking the way they had come. Emma barely had time to register it before the man shoved her forward. "Go! Keep moving!" They burst onto a side street, dodging past stunned pedestrians. Emma didn't dare look back. Her only focus was putting as much distance between them and whoever those men were. Finally, after what felt like forever, they slipped into the shadows of an abandoned building. The hooded man pressed his back against the wall, chest heaving. Emma followed suit, sucking in deep breaths. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the man exhaled shakily. "You shouldn't have followed me." Emma glared up at him. "You're the one who ran." He gave a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you've just walked into, kid." Emma straightened, the fear in her chest giving way to frustration. "Then tell me." The man hesitated, running a hand over his face. His gaze flickered toward the street, like he was waiting for more cars to show up. Then, he pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper. Emma frowned as he pressed it into her palm. "Read it when you're somewhere safe," he said, "and then do yourself a favor. Walk away." Before she could say another word, he turned and slipped back into the night, disappearing into the maze of back streets. Emma stood there, pulse still racing, staring down at the paper in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. 4 words were scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "Stay out of this." She swallowed hard. Her mind screamed at her to listen, to stop digging, to let the police handle it. But she couldn't. Not when her dad was still behind bars. Not when someone was willing to chase her through the streets just to keep her from asking questions. This wasn't just about a robbery anymore. This was bigger. She needed answers. She needed to find out who wanted her dad out of the way. And deep down, she knew exactly where to look. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls blending into the darkness. Emma pulled her hoodie tighter around her as she crept toward the side entrance, heart pounding. The building looked abandoned, but she knew better. This place wasn't empty. It was where the real truth was hiding. She pressed herself against the cold metal, peering through a broken window. Inside, dim lights flickered over stacks of wooden crates and heavy machinery. A few men stood near a table, their low voices blending with the hum of an old generator. And then she heard something that made her blood run cold. "It doesn't matter if the kids got proof. We made sure the cops found what they needed." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that voice. It was the prosecutor from her father's case. Her hands clenched into fists. They hadn't just arrested her father because of bad evidence. They had framed him. On purpose. Emma's hands trembled as she backed away from the window. Her mind raced, every nerve in her body screaming for her to run. The prosecutor was working with them. That meant this wasn't just some mistake. It was deliberate. Someone had wanted her father locked away and had made sure it happened. She needed help. There was only one person she could trust now. Emma banged on the motel room door, her chest heaving. Seconds later, it swung open. "Emma?" Matt Gray, her father's younger brother, blinked down at her, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "What the hell?" "I found something," she interrupted, pushing past him. "You were right. Dad was framed. And I know where." Matt shut the door behind her, rubbing a hand down his face. He looked the same as he always did. Messy stubble, an old jacket that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, and that same wary look in his eyes, like he never quite trusted the world around him. Matt and Jason hadn't spoken in years. They had fought over something. Emma never knew what, but right now that didn't matter. He was the only one who might believe her. Emma grabbed his arm. "They're working together, the prosecutor, these guys in suits. They planted evidence, Matt. They wanted him arrested." Matt cursed under his breath. "You sure about this?" "I heard them," she insisted. "At a warehouse. They think I'm just a kid, that I'll stop looking. But if we go back—" "No," Matt cut in, shaking his head. "That place isn't safe for you." Emma clenched her jaw. "Then let's make it unsafe for them." Matt exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. He was trying to think of a way out, a way around this. But there wasn't one. Either they exposed the truth, or her father spent the rest of his life in prison. After a long pause, Matt muttered, "This is a bad idea." Emma folded her arms. "I don't care." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You sound just like your dad." Emma didn't respond. She just grabbed her notebook and flipped to a blank page. "Okay," she said. "Here's the plan." They approached the warehouse just before midnight. Matt had brought a crowbar. Emma had brought nothing but her wits. "Stay close," Matt murmured, leading her through a hole in the fence. Emma nodded, her pulse hammering in her ears. Inside, the place was even bigger than she remembered. Crates were stacked in every direction, and the voices from before had faded into the background hum of distant conversation. Then, footsteps. Emma grabbed Matt's sleeve, yanking him behind a stack of crates just as a pair of men passed by. She recognized one of them, Victor Russo. Emma's breath caught. She had seen his face before, in newspapers, on TV. He wasn't just some criminal. He was a crime boss, and he was the one who wanted her father gone. "Everything's in place?" Russo was saying. "Yeah," one of his men replied. "Cops are locked in. The girl stirred things up, but it won't matter." Emma clenched her fists. Russo chuckled. "Shame. Kid's got guts." Matt tensed beside her. He had heard it too. Emma's mind raced. They needed proof. Something they could take to the police. Something they could show before Russo made sure no one ever listened to them again. Then she spotted it. A laptop. It was sitting on a desk, wires still plugged in, screen glowing faintly. If they could get to it, they could find the records. The bank transfers, the deals, everything. She turned to Matt. "Cover me." Matt swore under his breath. "Emma." But she was already moving. Heart pounding, she crept toward the desk, keeping low, stepping carefully. Russo and his men were still talking, their voices drifting through the warehouse. She reached the desk. Her hands shook as she opened the laptop. He clicked into the files. Then, footsteps. Too close. A shadow loomed over her. Emma barely had time to react before someone grabbed the back of her hoodie and yanked her off the chair. "Look what we have here," a deep voice drawled. Emma gasped, struggling, but the man's grip was iron tight. Russo turned, his gaze landing on her. His smirk disappeared. "Ah," he murmured. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Emma swallowed hard, but she lifted her chin. "You framed my dad." Russo's lips twitched. "And?" Emma's heart pounded. She could feel Matt moving behind the crates, staying hidden. But if he made a move too soon, they'd both be dead before they got out. "Think, Emma," Think. Her eyes flickered to the laptop. One move, that's all she had. So she made it. With every ounce of strength in her, she kicked backward, hard, slamming her heel into the shin of the man holding her. He yelped, loosening his grip just enough for Emma to twist free. Then, in one quick motion, she slammed her fist onto the keyboard. A loud, blaring siren erupted from the laptop speakers. Russo snapped his head toward the sound. What the? Then, lights flooded the warehouse, red and blue. Sirens outside. Matt had called the cops, and now Russo was out of time. Chaos erupted. The warehouse, once filled with quiet, calculated whispers, was now a storm of panic. Men scrambled, shoving crates, reaching for weapons, but it was already too late. The red and blue lights flashing through the high windows weren't just a warning. They were judgment. FBI! A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Drop your weapons and get on the ground! Russo spun toward the nearest exit, his calm facade cracking for the first time. Move! He barked at his men. But there was nowhere to go. Agents swarmed the warehouse, their guns drawn, barking orders. One by one, Russo's men dropped their weapons, hands raised in surrender. Matt yanked Emma behind cover, shielding her as the chaos unfolded. Through the blur of movement, Emma's gaze locked onto Russo. He wasn't surrendering. He was backing away, his hand slipping into his jacket. A gun. Before she could scream, a sharp crack echoed through the warehouse. Russo froze. A single red dot glowed against his chest, a sniper's laser. Drop it, an agent ordered. Russo's jaw clenched. For one agonizing second, Emma thought he might make a final, desperate move. Then, with a slow exhale, he let the gun fall. Two agents tackled him to the ground, shoving his arms behind his back. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists. It was over. Emma's body sagged against the crates, exhaustion crashing into her all at once. Matt placed a firm hand on her shoulder. You did good, kid. She swallowed, nodding, but she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about her father. The courtroom felt different this time, lighter, brighter. Emma sat in the front row, clutching her notebook, her breath shallow. Judge Carver cleared his throat, looking down at the official papers in front of him. After reviewing the newly presented evidence and in light of the recent FBI investigation into Victor Russo's criminal organization, he lifted his gaze, settling it on Jason Gray. All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed. A rush of sound filled the courtroom, gasps, murmurs, reporters whispering into microphones. But all Emma heard was her father's sharp intake of breath. She turned to him just in time to see relief crash over his face. Then he looked at her, and in the next moment, she was running. She threw herself into his arms, holding onto him as tightly as she could, as if letting go might make him disappear again. Jason held her just as fiercely, his voice shaking. You did it, kid. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. You were worth it, she whispered. Days later, Emma sat on the front porch of their house, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Everything was the same, the creaky steps, the peeling paint, the street light that flickered at night. But it felt different. Her father was home. The world had tried to take him away, and she had fought back. She opened her notebook, flipping past pages filled with hurried notes, sketches, timelines. And then she reached the last page. She picked up her pen and wrote, in small, careful letters, "The truth always comes out." For now, it was over. But deep down, she knew. Somewhere out there, someone was still watching. And the fight for justice? It was never truly finished. If you found Emma's journey inspiring, her fight for justice, her refusal to back down, then don't let this be just another story. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a gripping, real-world battle for truth. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Emma's place? Justice isn't just found in the courtroom. Sometimes it takes one voice to change everything. Stay curious, stay fearless, and we'll see you in the next story.